You're looking at new footage released by Russia's defense ministry showing clashes with Ukraine in the Kursk region. Russia says it conducted airstrikes on Ukrainian reserve forces, killing 400 soldiers and damaging 32 armored vehicles. Some reports suggest Ukraine may have advanced through the Russian town of Sudza up to 35 kilometers into the Kursk region. Russia claims to have halted Ukrainian advancements along the border, but evidence suggests the cross-border fighting is ongoing. How will Russia respond to this surprise incursion? Riley Bailey is a Russia analyst at the Institute for the Study of War, and he joins me now. Hello, Riley, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into how Russia will respond, what have you heard about how Russia has responded so far?
The Russian response so far to the Ukrainian incursion to Kursk Oblast has been very chaotic, not very organized, and it really hasn't materialized yet, which suggests to us that Ukrainian forces were able to achieve a kind of operational surprise here that both sides really haven't been able to achieve in the war for a year and a half of fighting now. The Russian military command has a few decisions about how they could respond. They could rely on the forces that they currently have deployed to Kursk Oblast. A lot of those are less combat effective units, however. A lot of them are filled out with Russian conscripts that the Russian military command has not deployed to Ukraine and has instead used for border security functions. We've seen a whole lot of those units either surrender or not respond sufficiently to a whole lot of the cross-border Ukrainian attacks that we have seen. And so if the Russian military command decides that those units aren't sufficient enough, they're going to have to pull forces from elsewhere. They could pull forces from the northern grouping of forces. This is the grouping of forces that the Russian military command set up along the international border, specifically to launch offensive operations into northern Kharkiv Oblast in early May.
So there is a chance that Russia will have to reallocate forces from its offensive operations to fend off this counteroffensive, perhaps you could call it, from Ukraine?
It's a larger operation. I won't speak to the intent of that Ukrainian operation, but it will generate these pressures. And the Russian military command may determine that conducting a serious defensive operation in Kursk Oblast does require pulling elements from elsewhere and kind of constraining their capability to continue some of these consistent grinding offensive operations that we've seen elsewhere in Ukraine.
Now, Riley, you mentioned surprise. Obviously, surprise and confusion gives you a significant advantage in war. But because of that, we're seeing conflicting and competing reports about what is actually happening in Kursk right now. I understand you've been gathering and examining some of these reports. So paint a picture for me, to the best of your knowledge, what is happening right now in this battle?
Yeah, I'll paint a broad picture.
Sure.
Right now, we see reports of very fast, mobile, rapid Ukrainian groups trying to bypass Russian positions and enter far into the Russian rear in Kursk Oblast. Yesterday, we saw Russian reporting that Ukrainian forces made it as far as 35 kilometers into Kursk Oblast. But those groups aren't necessarily trying to hold territory. And so we've seen reports today that Ukrainian forces may not be that far as it stands right now. In other areas, we do see reports that Ukrainian forces are trying to seize settlements, to consolidate positions, and even fortify some of their positions. So a lot of this is fluid, and I think some sources are mixing up the units that are rapidly moving and the units that are trying to consolidate positions, and kind of mixing up what those two activities suggest is happening.
And so you mentioned the element of surprise. Certainly it seems like Russia was surprised. You described their response as chaotic. Some analysts have remarked on the psychological impact that this could have, as well as the military and tactical impact. Some have suggested it's going to have sort of this weakening effect on Putin's image as a strong man, that it might chip away at that. So how might this surprise factor impact how Russians view Putin as a leader?
I definitely think the operation, however long it continues, however far Ukraine makes into Kursk Oblast, is a strategic blow to the image that Putin has tried to portray to Russians and the rest of the world. Putin has tried to cement this legacy of internal stability, security, and geopolitical resurgence. Another military crossing the border and seizing settlements and holding territory really challenges that view. And because of that, Putin and the Kremlin are going to see this as an imperative to respond to. And we might see an outsized prioritization to retake territory here that might disrupt operations elsewhere.
Well, given those factors, the potential psychological, symbolic, and political impacts of this incursion onto Russian territory, how do you expect those factors to contribute to the response here? You talked about that a little bit, but can you elaborate?
Yeah, I definitely think something that we are seeing a lot of concern about is this perception that this is a threat to civilians, that this is not something that the Russian military command has really had to deal with in launching its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces very much are fine with causing civilian casualties in Ukraine, but I think we're going to see much more consternation, much more debate, much more consideration about how Russian forces conduct operations in Kursk Oblast to speak to those concerns about possible Russian civilian casualties.
And U.S. officials have reaffirmed their support for Ukraine and have said that the Kursk operation is not a violation of their imposed restrictions on Ukraine's use of foreign supplied arms. But how do you foresee the international reaction contributing to the future of this battle?
We'll see where the international reaction goes. I think something very important here has actually happened. The Kremlin has routinely engaged in these very concerted informational efforts to convince the West, to convince Ukraine that there are certain red lines in the war, and that if the West reached a certain level of support for Ukraine, that would be a level at which the war would escalate and that Russia would threaten the West with direct confrontation. Throughout the war in Ukraine, we've seen that all of those red lines have not been met with actual Russian responses, that they've been hollow. And I think this operation here really proves that a whole lot of that red line rhetoric from the Kremlin is false, that it won't be backed up with serious action. And so the current restrictions on Western-provided weapons to Ukraine, specifically Ukraine's ability to use those weapons to strike into Russian territory, to strike military targets far into the rear, I think this operation really proves that concerns about that are unfounded.
I wonder, though, we're almost out of time, but how concerned should Western powers be about one of those red lines not being false? About a miscalculation of some sort?
I don't think it would be a miscalculation. I think the Kremlin has routinely proven that these red lines are false, that the threats that they insinuated or backed them up with didn't come true when Abrams arrived in Ukraine, when the F-16s arrived in Ukraine, when the Patriots arrived in Ukraine, when the ATACMS and the HIMARS arrived in Ukraine. All those were red lines. Yet nothing has happened. Escalation, direct confrontation has not happened.
All right. Riley Bailey is an analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. I appreciate you taking the time today, sir.
Thank you for having me.